Imagine walking through a swamp so thick that even the sun refuses to touch the water. The air clings to your skin like a wet shroud. The cypress knees jut out like broken teeth. Alligators lie beneath the black water, waiting, indistinguishable from fallen logs. In this forgotten corner of Louisiana, between 1857 and 1859, 12 men vanished. Not lost, not dead by accident, vanished. Their names belong to records that no longer breathe life into memory. And yet whispers persist among those who survived the terror. There was a man who dug graves before death even arrived. A man who understood the soil as intimately as a killer understands a blade. His name was Solomon Tibido, and he was the shadow behind every plantation owner's confidence. To the world, he was a simple gravedigger, a keeper of the dead. To the enslaved, he was something else entirely, someone who listened, remembered, and waited. Years of forced labor, decades of watching cruelty, patience sharpened by injustice, coalesced into a quiet, unstoppable power. And one night, that power finally awoke. By the end of this story, you will understand how the very earth could betray men who thought themselves untouchable, how silence can become a weapon, and how one man turned centuries of oppression into a reckoning buried 6 feet deep. Solomon Tibido was born in 1817 in a land that did not forgive weakness. His father, a freed Creole man, had taught him the sacred work of graves, while his mother remained enslaved, a constant reminder that freedom was a precarious illusion. Solomon's childhood was measured in spade strokes, in the silent observation of suffering. By the time he could walk, he had learned the geometry of death, how to dig without collapsing the earth, how to bury a body in a hole that would never betray its occupant. The swamps around Terabon and Laforj parishes became his classroom. Each shadowy path, each hidden channel, each dry island in the marsh taught him secrets the wealthy could not imagine. He could move unseen, unheard, across miles of isolation. Plantation owners saw him as obedient, silent, indispensable, a man who bent to labor and left no trace beyond the soil he tilled. But Solomon carried something the masters could not touch: memory. He remembered the faces of the beaten, the children whose screams echoed in the cane fields, the women whose bodies were property and nothing more. That memory hardened into something almost crystalline, a quiet inevitability. It was patience shaped into power, waiting for the moment when the scale would tip, when the very men who had measured life and death would learn that the grave could be wielded as a weapon. Jack Dero was a man who believed power made him untouchable. 2,000 acres, over 100 enslaved people, a kingdom built on terror and cruelty. He had never considered that the ground beneath his feet could betray him. That summer of 1857, he received a note, a simple summons to a boundary dispute at the old cemetery near Bayou Black. Written in careful hand, signed by a respected freedman, it seemed ordinary. He saw no reason for suspicion. Solomon Tibido had delivered it. The gravedigger had always been presentable, reliable, invisible. When Dero arrived under the thick Spanish moss, moonlight barely grazing his coat, Solomon emerged from shadow, calm, polite. "Mr. Dero, I prepared a test excavation for the boundary line. Step here, please." Dero stepped, lantern in hand, into the hole, 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, the perfect grave. In that moment, the years of cruelty, of broken bodies and shattered lives, became the blade that cut his freedom. Solomon struck from behind, a calculated blow, enough to stun but not kill. Dero collapsed into the pit he did not know existed, the lantern rolling into the darkness. Above him, Solomon's eyes were calm, unreadable, carrying the weight of decades of memory and the first taste of justice. That night, the swamp became the executioner, and Dero its first victim, buried alive by the hands that had dug so many graves before him. What made Solomon terrifying was not brute strength, it was calculation. 40 years of digging, of measuring death, had taught him more than anatomy. It had taught him patience. Every hole he prepared, every spade of earth turned, was rehearsal. He studied his victims the way a master chess player studies pawns, knights, kings. Each plantation owner had a pattern: when they woke, when they dined, when they thought themselves untouchable. Solomon memorized it all. He knew the soft spots in their houses, the weak points in their bodies, the places where fear could settle like a stone. Before he struck, he ensured the world would not notice, that his actions would be invisible, buried in plain sight. Jack Dero's disappearance was not an anomaly, it was a blueprint. The grave was prepared, the path cleared, the swamp ready to swallow the screams. And yet, Solomon was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was a collector of debts that time and cruelty had accrued. Each shovel of dirt that pressed against Dero's chest was history exacting its toll. He was not a man, not merely a gravedigger. He was the arbiter of balance, the hand that finally tilted the scales. And in that stillness, beneath the moss, the swamp, and the night sky, the first lesson was clear. No man, no matter how powerful, could escape the reckoning he had earned. 3 weeks after Dero vanished, Emile Broussard followed the same path into oblivion. Broussard was smaller in wealth, but larger in cruelty, a man who rented enslaved men for breeding and punished women whose children displeased him. That night, Solomon's plan unfolded like clockwork. The swamp was still thick fog curling over black water. Broussard had no reason to suspect danger. The gravedigger had always been presentable, silent, dependable. Yet beneath that calm exterior, Solomon carried decades of memory, decades of quiet vengeance. He prepared the whole as meticulously as the first, every dimension exact, every edge perfect. The blow came swift, precise, as if the earth itself had struck. Broussard's body fell into the pit, stunned but conscious, the realization dawning too late. The hands that had dug hundreds of graves for his victims now held his life in balance. Solomon filled the soil slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic thump of each shovel echoing through the night like a metronome of justice. And when Broussard's screams faded beneath the weight of the earth, Solomon did not linger. He wiped his hands, adjusted his hat, and walked home through the fog, leaving no trace beyond the soft settling of soil. By the time morning arrived, the world would notice nothing, and history's balance would inch another step toward equilibrium. Solomon was not driven by rage alone. He was driven by an intimate knowledge of power, cruelty, and the fragility of life when held in the hands of men like Dero and Broussard. He had spent decades observing how the mighty wielded terror over the weak, how a glance, a whip, a command could erase a human soul. In every measured stroke of his spade, he enacted a calculus few could understand. Justice in his hands was not blind. It was surgical, precise, inevitable. The swamp had taught him silence. The deaths of innocents had taught him patience. Each subsequent plantation owner received a carefully crafted summons, each one walking into a trap built from trust, invisibility, and decades of anticipation. Solomon's method was almost poetic. Strike only when the moment is perfect, leave no sign. Let the swamp and the world swallow the evidence. He became a master of rhythm, the timing of disappearance, the orchestration of soil, the concealment of fear. And as the bodies accumulated beneath the earth he knew intimately, a strange equilibrium settled inside him. The blood debt of decades of oppression was being repaid in silence, invisibly, in a way the law could never comprehend. Solomon had become more than a gravedigger. He had become the instrument through which history whispered its most forbidden truths. By the summer of 1858, the pattern was undeniable, though only to those who could see it. 12 men, all masters of plantations, all architects of cruelty, had vanished without trace. Authorities scratched their heads, families whispered rumors, never daring to speak them aloud. And yet Solomon moved with the calm inevitability of a river carving stone. He knew that the world believed him invisible, unremarkable, a simple gravedigger tending to ordinary deaths, but he had become something else entirely, a shadow that shaped fate. Each disappearance was a lesson, each grave a testament to decades of observed injustice. He had learned to measure terror, to bend it, to convert it into silence so absolute that even the living could not perceive its orchestration. And now I want you to do something, a small ritual to mark your own entrance into this world of hidden truths. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice. Type it slowly, deliberately, as if sealing a pact with the unseen. This is not just for the algorithm. It is a commitment, a recognition that the knowledge you are receiving is dangerous, that it will change the way you perceive power, cruelty, and the forces hiding behind polite society. Once written, return here. The swamp, the graves, the unseen hands moving beneath the surface, they are all watching. The third man to vanish was Augustin Landry, a planter who prided himself on refinement while hiding instruments of torture in his office. Solomon knew his habits, his pride, his belief that elegance could shield him from consequence. The swamp had become a classroom, and Augustin was the lesson. Solomon lured him with the same deceptive civility, a summons to inspect property boundaries under moonlight. Landry, dressed in imported finery, stepped confidently into the darkness, unaware that every step had been anticipated. The hole awaited, perfectly measured, the same quiet inevitability as before. Solomon struck with precision, stunning Landry long enough to roll him into the grave. Above, the moss swayed, indifferent to human cruelty, as Solomon began filling the earth with deliberate slowness. Each shovel echoed with history. The cries of the enslaved he had buried, the quiet patience of years spent watching power misuse life itself. Landry clawed at the soil, but he was unprepared for the methodical rhythm of a man who had studied leverage, anatomy, and fear for decades. As the earth pressed against his chest, he understood for the first time the weight of all the suffering he had inflicted. By the time Solomon tamped down the soil and smoothed the surface, the swamp had swallowed another master, and the balance had shifted. Each man who stepped into Solomon's meticulously prepared traps experienced a terror no wealth could shield them from. The first seconds were disbelief. How could the world conspire against them while they stood on familiar soil? Then came realization, the slow sinking horror of knowing that every advantage, every guard, every gun, every moneyed influence meant nothing. The walls of the grave pressed against their chest, the weight of earth replicating decades of oppression inflicted on others. Solomon worked above them with methodical calm, every motion a lesson in inevitability. Their screams echoed briefly through the cypress, but no one would hear. It was not just physical confinement. It was the embodiment of history turning on those who had wielded it so cruelly. The rhythm of his spade became ritualistic, each shovel of dirt a heartbeat of vengeance. The swamp watched silently, the fog absorbing cries, and the stars bore witness to justice delivered by patient hands. Solomon had transformed decades of quiet observation into something unstoppable. Each disappearance was both a conclusion and a prelude, a demonstration of power transferred from the tyrants to the man who had once bent under the weight of their cruelty. And with every final breath muffled by soil, the world moved a little closer to the truths most would never dare confront. Solomon's brilliance lay in adaptation. Each disappearance was a lesson, a proof that the world's laws, its authority, could be bent if one knew its patterns intimately. He learned to anticipate curiosity, to exploit trust, to turn propriety into a weapon. Every plantation owner thought themselves clever, vigilant, untouchable, but Solomon was always a step ahead. He studied each man's routines, their strengths, their weaknesses, their arrogance, and tailored his traps with surgical precision. The graves themselves became instruments of control. Dimensions, placement, and timing honed until survival was impossible. When Emile Broussard vanished, the authorities thought accident. When Augustin Landry disappeared, whispers of the swamp consumed the explanation. Solomon observed, refined, and waited. He understood that fear could be a tool, even for those who believed themselves immune. And yet, he never hurried. Speed was secondary to inevitability. The swamp itself became his accomplice. Fog, darkness, waterlogged soil, even the cypress knees concealing his paths. Each disappearance reinforced the illusion. These men had been swallowed by the earth, or the swamp, or fate itself. But fate was not random. Solomon was fate, incarnate, wielding centuries of suppressed knowledge. And the men who had once held absolute power learned, too late, that the quiet hands of the gravedigger could wield a far deadlier authority than any sword or whip. By late 1858, the remaining plantation owners felt unease they could not name. Rumors whispered through the swamps, but the truth was invisible, buried beneath layers of earth and silence. Solomon had become a force they could not perceive, an inevitability moving just beyond their vision. He struck with patience and precision, each disappearance rehearsed, each grave sculpted like a hidden monument. Men who once believed themselves untouchable now trembled before shadows they could not define. The swamp had become a theater of justice, and Solomon its conductor. Each trap, each careful note, each measured encounter was calculated to evoke the exact terror he desired. The realization that no status, no wealth, no cruelty could shield them from the reckoning they had earned. As the graves multiplied, the weight of history pressed down like the soil he shoveled. And you, watching this unfold, must understand, this is not mere story. It is a blueprint for power, for invisibility, for the quiet execution of what the world refuses to acknowledge. Write it in your mind. Patience becomes dominance. Observation becomes authority. And when history itself is a weapon, even the mighty fall silently into the earth. The final men were different, not weaker, not careless, but confident in the illusion that they could outsmart history, outmaneuver inevitability. Solomon knew better. He had studied them all, each minute of arrogance recorded in memory, each assumption catalogued for exploitation. When they arrived at their appointed meeting places, the graves awaited like silent sentinels, perfectly measured, precisely concealed beneath moss and shadow. One by one, they fell into the rhythm of Solomon's design, stunned, rolled into the earth, the weight of decades of cruelty pressing against their chests. He did not rush. He orchestrated each burial like a dark symphony, every shovel of soil a note in a composition older than the plantations themselves. Their cries were muffled, brief, irrelevant to the world above. The swamp absorbed their terror, leaving no evidence, no record beyond the soft settling of leaves and cypress needles. By the time authorities noticed the pattern, the 12 men had vanished, and the truth was already buried deeper than any law could reach. Solomon walked home each night through fog and shadow, the satisfaction of justice mingled with the quiet exhaustion of decades of patience. In that swamp, in that darkness, power had changed hands, and the hands of the gravedigger held it, absolute, unchallenged, terrifying in its simplicity. Above ground, life continued almost unchanged. The plantations remained, the swamps remained, and the world above remained oblivious. 12 men had vanished, leaving behind uncertainty, fear, and rumors, but no evidence that could tie the crimes to a single pair of hands. Solomon returned to his cabin each night, the swamp's fog a cloak around him, his work complete yet quietly reverberating. Inside, a transformation had taken root. The man who had bent under decades of forced labor, who had witnessed atrocities with silent restraint, had become an instrument of history itself. Power, Solomon realized, was not granted by wealth, bloodline, or violence. It was wielded through patience, knowledge, and invisibility. He had watched the mighty fall, felt their panic, measured their terror, and in doing so understood the truth of dominion. The world fears what it cannot see, what it cannot predict, what it cannot control. He had become both observer and arbiter, a shadow above the living, a keeper of a hidden equilibrium that the world was neither meant to perceive nor survive. And as the swamps whispered and the graves settled, one lesson remained clear. True power is silent, precise, and inevitable, and those who abuse it will always answer in kind. The authorities searched, dragged the bayous, questioned the enslaved, and examined the plantations. They found nothing. 12 men had disappeared, and yet no corpse, no evidence, no whisper of Solomon's work reached the surface. The reports were brief, vague, easily dismissed. Officially, men had left town, fallen into swamps, or vanished without explanation. But the truth was more unsettling. The world above could not comprehend the quiet precision of a grave digger who had spent a lifetime mastering invisibility. Each investigation faltered because it sought noise, evidence, witnesses. Solomon had learned the law's rhythms, its assumptions, its blindness, and exploited them with surgical patience. And in that gap between action and recognition, history was rewritten, or rather, hid. No reward, no trial, no recognition would follow. The world above was too invested in its illusions of control. Yet the swamp remembered, the graves remembered. And Solomon, walking through the fog, understood a law older than any statute. Those who manipulate life and death care little for human constructs, and those who wield power without conscience will inevitably meet a reckoning the world cannot see. In the silence of the cypress, justice had its own voice, and it spoke only to those willing to listen. Solomon lived the rest of his days in quiet solitude, yet he was never truly alone. The swamp held memory, the graves held secrets, and the weight of the lives he had balanced pressed on him like a second skin. He had enacted a justice invisible to the world above, a reckoning no law could comprehend. But in carrying the sins of the powerful, he had absorbed something darker, the understanding of how fragile life and morality truly are. Every footstep through the mist, every creak of the cypress, reminded him that the line between observer and arbiter, between survival and dominance, is thin and precise. The men he buried alive remained beneath the earth, their terror and their powerlessness etched into soil and memory alike. And the world continued on, unaware, blind to the lessons of patience, vigilance, and invisible authority. Solomon had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of the truth that the powerful are never invincible, that history has hidden hands, and that patience and knowledge can shift the balance of life and death. In the shadows, power whispers, and only those who understand the silence can truly wield it. The story of Solomon Tibido is not merely history, it is a warning. Power, cruelty, and dominance leave traces, but only the patient, the observant, the invisible can reclaim balance. Solomon showed that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers beneath the fog, beneath the cypress, beneath the very ground itself. The 12 men buried alive were reminders that the world above, the world of law, status, and wealth, does not always see and often does not care. But beneath the surface, a different order exists, shaped by knowledge, patience, and the courage to act when no one is watching. Remember this, the most dangerous men are those who move unseen, who understand history, power, and fear. And you, sitting here witnessing these truths, are now a participant. You know what most will never see. You understand that the visible world is a fragile veneer over a deeper, darker reality. Guard that knowledge. Use it wisely. The swamps, the graves, the shadows, they remember. And the next time you encounter power unchecked, remember Solomon Tibido. Remember the weight of patience, the inevitability of balance, and the silent authority of a man who taught the world a lesson it could never.